Hello everyone. Tonight we start with something far more complex and dangerous, dating in the Middle Ages, rather than a philosopher or a monarch. In some ways, finding love during a period of plagues, dowries and chaperones was even more odd than messaging someone at 2 in the morning. From courtly love songs to marriage by livestock negotiation, medieval romance was less about butterflies and more about land rights. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. So you're standing in a medieval village, or maybe a chilly stone castle, wondering how to find love. Perhaps start a discussion, congratulate someone on their hose, find out if they visit here frequently. No, none of this operates that way. Dating in the contemporary sense doesn't really exist if you're in your middle years. You don't text, flirt, or take long walks to gauge interest. Rather, your parents, your lord, or your abbot are already making decisions on who you will marry, when you will be married, and how many cows you will need to get married. You've most likely been engaged since before your voice fell, if you're a noble. On your wedding day, you may meet your prospective spouse for the first time. That's as uncomfortable as it sounds, I agree. Everything revolves around land, titles, and familial ties, not their lute solo skills or compatibility. Things are a little less formal if you're a peasant, but not much. Love isn't really discussed, yet your family still has a lot to say. Perhaps a good girl whose family has a fruitful goat is someone your parents know. Perhaps a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off is something people admire. Boom, you're courting now, lucky you. It's not that people in the Middle Ages don't feel romantic. They do, it's just not the priority. Social stability, inheritance, and survival are the objectives. Do you fall in love before being married? That's dangerous. Are you in love but not married? That is scandalous. In any case, it's not acceptable. Go crazy unless you're a character in a case. You still dream, though. Maybe you use a piece of parchment to compose a small verse. Perhaps you peek across the marketplace. It's possible that you fall in love with someone who wasn't pre-approved by the livestock appraiser for your family. But for now, you wait. You obey. You try not to fall for the miller's apprentice, because poets may be pursuing love in this world. However, parents, clergymen, and politicians are involved in marriage. You find someone attractive. Perhaps it's the way they hold a basket of onions aloft. Perhaps it's the assured manner in which they remove muck from rugs. Your heart skips a beat like a medieval one. But calm down, because without a balance sheet, romance in this world doesn't blossom. Before you even think about courtship, you better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is a charming personality, you might want to sit down. You'll need property, animals, tools, or a roof that doesn't leak a lot if you're a young man. Love letters are pleasant. However, nothing says husband material like a roof that can withstand a minor storm and 2 healthy oxen. You might want to think about becoming a priest if your father has already promised your brother the best goat. Your family requires a dowry if you're a young woman. That might be money, clothes, or an oddly large quantity of geese. No matter how clever you are, you will probably have to spend a lot of time honing your stitching skills by yourself if your family cannot afford it. Imagine for a moment that you genuinely like someone who lights up your heart. At the well, your gazes meet. A spark is present. It's romantic. It's poetic. It makes no difference at all, because you might as well fall in love with a cloud until your families are financially equal. It gets worse if you're a noble person. Your marriage is dependent on political favors, boundaries, and land. You are more than just a human. You're a walking treaty. Well done. No one is secure, not even peasants. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for irrigation rights. And yet you try. Perhaps you give a tiny present, a handful of berries, your best slightly broken cup, or a carved spoon. Perhaps they grin. Perhaps they don't. However, the reality still stands. In medieval dating, flirting is economic, and love is merely a byproduct that you hope your partner would ultimately acquire. Assume, then, that you are not a nobleman negotiating treaties or a farmer fretting over pigs. Suppose you are a knight, shiny armor, large horse, poor poetic abilities. How is your romantic life going? Greetings from the bizarre and emotionally draining realm of courtly romance. Now, this isn't dating, this is performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime. It's completely impractical, half flirtatious, and half spiritually distressing. A noble woman, generally already married, is chosen by you, the gallant knight, and you promise to love her from a distance, naturally not physically. Everything would be ruined by that. No, you're meant to be in pain, with style. You could write some tortured poetry about her hair burning like the sun, or about her silver laugh, which means she didn't offend your family and had hair, to use medieval terminology. At tournaments, you dress in her colors. You pine, you let out a sigh. Sometimes you joust someone because he took too long to look at her. The role of the lady? She is expected to maintain a level of cold detachment that would frighten a glacier, while seeming as though this is all really flattering. She might reply with a letter, a token, or perhaps a ribbon, but the main goal will be to remain elusive and enigmatic. There are strong feelings. The real touch? Very little. At most, you might receive a finger grazing your gauntlet during a feast, or a nod from the person on the other side of the hall. If you do anything more, it's no longer courtly love. It's a scandal, or adultery, which is worse, and nobody desires that. At least not officially. When everyone agreed that it was mostly a fictitious situation, the entire setup functioned at its finest. It provided a means of expressing devotion, desire, and creative anxiety without upsetting the social order. Think of it as a medieval venting system. Was it a dramatic moment? Of course. Was there more poetry than pragmatism involved? Always. But courtly love offered you something to write about and someone to write for on a night when you were caught between wars and boredom. Just don't anticipate a kiss, a happy ending, or even eye contact. You have fallen in love. Fantastic. In a world where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is essentially a declaration of war, this is the difficult part, showing that affection. Greetings from the medieval solution. Tokens. Consider it texting in the 12th century. Slow, unclear, and susceptible to dramatically erroneous interpretation. Consider yourself a knight who is madly in love with Lady Marjorie, whichever her last name may be. You can't talk to her by yourself because her confessor keeps intercepting your poetry. What are you doing? You send a glove to her. Or even your sleeve with embroidery. Sending someone a piece of your wardrobe is the perfect way to show someone you love them. And what if you're the one getting it? Congratulations. Now you have the romantic burden of seeming as though you understand what it means, as well as a damp linen sleeve that you didn't request. Is he making a love confession? Do you need a favor? Calling for a duel? Who knows? Women also contributed tokens, a little necklace, a strand of hair, and a ribbon. Yes, it was heartfelt, but it was also quite calculated. Someone with a drinking problem and a sluggish eye will suddenly speak for you if you give the wrong guy the wrong token. The purpose of tokens was to be subtle. Your chest is pinned with a glove, a ribbon fastened to the hilt of your sword. Nobody articulated what it meant, but everyone knew what it meant. Better still, make it more cryptic. The focus was on plausible deniability rather than communication. This glove, huh? No, Lady Joan isn't the source. Randomly, it just showed up on my pillow, lavender-scented. Tokens were easier for the average person to use. Perhaps a handkerchief you knitted while you weren't milking something, or perhaps a wood carving. Even though there were more calluses, it was still romantic. And tokens were dangerous. Rumors could start if you give one to the wrong person. When you got one you didn't want, you had to figure out how to return someone's sock without making fun of their family. Despite their discomfort, these trinkets had genuine emotional significance. In a world that didn't have much space for it, they served as symbols of love. At last, you muster the bravery to approach your crush. Offer them a flower, perhaps recite a little crappy verse that you most certainly did not plagiarize from a traveling minstrel. You're prepared for a private moment. Sadly, you're not by yourself. Love is never blind in the world of medieval dating monitoring. Your mother, your priest, an inquisitive cousin, and occasionally all three at once keep a close eye on it. Assume you are a young woman who is ready to get married. You never go on a stroll alone. Margaret and her horribly strict aunt are accompanying you on a walk, and she's already critiquing your posture. Someone is watching, even if you're just getting water. There's always someone looking, more espionage, less dating, and you'd best hope that her family, her parish priest, and the local gossip network approve of you if you're a man attempting to court someone. When you arrive at her house with flowers, her mother is feigning to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours, her father is sharpening something behind the door, and the town priest chances to be passing by on his way to morning prayers at sunset. All of this oversight had a straightforward rationale. Preserve family honor, uphold morality, and refrain from any unapproved touching at all costs, particularly before marriage, when you're alone, and at all times. The purpose of chaperones was to keep an eye on harmless relationships. Group activities, walks, supervision, and sitting on benches within 2 meters of one another, but only if someone's grandmother is knitting close by and acting as though she isn't listening. Naturally, the church had a lot of opinions. In the same manner that a bouncer controls a nightclub, it controlled courting. Priests published long treatises on the perils of flirting and preached about appropriate behavior. That's correct indeed. Anti-flirting textbooks were published by medieval clergy. Imagine someone copying things out by candlelight as monks around the scriptorium silently condemn you. Writing letters wasn't safe either. Some monks just screened love letters for moral content before opening them. Indeed, heavenly censorship. You will therefore need to become used to falling in love in private, in front of your entire extended family, and perhaps even in front of God. You're in love, or at least in the medieval sense, which is characterized by a lot of pacing, by windows, bewilderment, and desire. You've looked at each other over a feast. Perhaps they did not quickly toss your dropped handkerchief into the fire after picking it up. The strain is intolerable. You are still unable to speak freely, though. Fathers, mums, and chaperones hover like emotional border patrol agents. What do you do then? You compose a letter, the covert love letter? Since the notice of excommunication, this piece of parchment has been the most perilous. Here's your opportunity to open up in the most cryptic, overly poetic way possible. Because it's not enough to just say, "I like you." You must say, "My soul is a stag, pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning." Naturally, you write your message on rough parchment or vellum if you are literate, which isn't often the case, let's face it. If you're very committed, you dust it with scent or petals from flowers. Just use caution when doing that. An aristocrat unintentionally wrapped a herring in a love letter and gave it to the wrong girl. They are now wed. Everything is all right. The delivery issue now arises. You can't simply give it to them. You need a bribed monk, a faithful servant, a courier, or a younger brother who doesn't fully comprehend the repercussions. In certain cases, a minstrel could even perform your poem in the town square while feigning anonymity. Delicate. What about the poetry? Dangerous, extremely dangerous. During Lent, the distinction between heresy and romance was as slender as a monk's tolerance. You may find yourself admitting to both passion and literary hyperbole if your metaphor even alluded to anything physical. However, people did write in spite of all the regulations. A few letters made it through. Some poetry was circulated like forbidden fruit after being copied. A folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary in a world of strict roles and continual oversight. You write as a result. You take a chance. You speak everything you can't express out loud while pressing your quivering hand to the page. Don't sign it too clearly, though. You don't want a church trial, you want romance. A respite at last, a day of feasting, a festival of harvest, a dance with a maypole. In other words, a unique opportunity to live a life other than labor, prayer, and acting as though you had no interest in the blacksmith's daughter. You are free to flirt today, in a way, so long as nobody notices, or they all see but act as though they don't. Greetings from medieval festivities where romance blossoms as everyone you've ever known keeps a close eye on you. 3 chickens, too. One of the few socially acceptable occasions for men and women to interact, laugh, and, dare we say it, look at each other was at festivals. Music is playing. All is there. Someone with dangerous confidence is wearing a flower crown. Never have you seen so many folks who don't pretend to be unhappy. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by catching a greased pig, winning the sack race, or balancing 3 stale bread rolls. Nothing conveys availability like a dignified fall from a hay bale. Your best chance of making physical contact was through dancing. A well-timed spin or a not-quite-accidental hand graze may express more than any sonnet, but the rules were strict. For instance, the maypole dance was really a huge pretext for concerted courtship, disguised as plausible deniability and ribbons. And if you're a noble, you'll flirt at a festival with more poetry and less hay. You could improvise a verse, liken your lady's eyes to twin candles or other glowing objects, and present a trinket, if it wasn't obviously produced by your servant 5 minutes ago. Food also helped. Give your sweetie a honey cake or a meat pie. You're doing well if they grin as they accept it. If they hand it to their dog, start over with someone else. But remember, everything you do, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, a bard, with a big mouth, one misstep, and your flirty smile becomes a youthful indiscretion discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. You can pretend, though, for a few hours. Imagine living in a society where dancing in public doesn't result in penance, where love isn't a transaction, and where laughter isn't viewed with suspicion. Suppose you're not a nobleman, a knight, or a bard with a lute and a lot of emotions. You're just an ordinary villager. You spend the most of the day ankle-deep in muck, wake up with the cows and go to bed with the hens. A lyrical soulmate is not what you're searching for. Someone who can milk a goat without causing emotional drama is what you're searching for. Greetings from rustic courting, where chemistry allows us to go through the winter together, romance is realistic, and gestures are modest. In your environment, dating is more about working together on projects than it is about having lengthy chats. Someone who works hard, doesn't complain a lot, and has a good set of teeth makes you notice them. That's all. That's the entire list. You're not picky, you're realistic. You don't need fireworks. Someone who can gut a fish and possibly doesn't snore too loudly is what you need. How do you express interest, then? You present gifts, little, practical items, an excellent turnip, a basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, and, if you're feeling adventurous, perhaps a carved spoon or a weaved ribbon. Nothing says, "I'm serious about you," like a spoon you whittled by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen during shared chores. You may talk while caring for sheep, travel to the mill together, or make small talk while shoveling something that smells suspect. Poetry isn't being recited, you're discussing crop yields, the weather, and whether or not old Thomas fell into the well once more. However, it is romantic in its own way. The simplicity has a certain charm to it, a communal existence based on collaboration rather than idealism. You are aware of each other's advantages, disadvantages, and how quickly they can flee if a goat escapes. Frequently proposals were made fast, marriage followed if you both agreed, and the families approved as well. You may have moved into a communal hut. Perhaps the village helped you construct a new one from the ground up. You brought your finest blanket, a goat was brought by them. You started the odd miracle of domestic survival together. It's honest, but it's not glamorous. You've succeeded. You've discovered someone who can tolerate your family, cook, clean, and doesn't flinch when they see your feet. Isn't that true love? It's time for marriage, which implies you're signing a contract in medieval parlance. Not a romantic promise made in the stars, a binding contract that is frequently negotiated with the fervor of a livestock auction. It is significant even if you are a peasant. You try to avoid tripping over the Latin throughout the ceremony, speak with the local priest, and assemble a few witnesses. But there is a serious checklist hidden behind the charming-sounding blessings. Who gets the cow, land rights, dower, and what happens if someone passes away during planting season? Yes, romance. Hold on tight if you belong to the upper class. Your union is a complex legal wrangling match. Your parents, their parents, a scribe, a priest, or perhaps a cousin who was a law student. They all have a hand in it. The bride and groom are mainly just standing close by, bowing when someone speaks to them and appearing ornamental. The person you're marrying may or may not even be someone you've met. The math has been done by your family. Her lands are needed by your estate, her dowry helps you pay off your debts, and your two coats of arms complement one another nicely. Love is a choice, the merger isn't. Additionally, marriage is a lifelong commitment. Unless you can demonstrate that someone was not baptized, was secretly connected to you, or passed away and neglected to mention it, divorce isn't truly a thing. There were annulments, but they came with a hefty price tag, a lot of paperwork, and a little bit of luck. It's not all bad, though. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other, shared chores, raising children, surviving winters. These things have a way of building affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church was involved in every step. One of the 7 major sacraments was marriage. You married for more than simply the law. God needed a witness, possibly 2, so you got married. As someone gives over a bag of onions and declares it a blessing, you stand, exchange vows, and smile. What if you've had enough? Enough negotiations, enough contracts, enough being handled like a special bag of flour. You're a lord. You want to marry for love, though, for once. Just love, not for land, not for family, not for your father's political aspirations. Well done, you're going to start a scandal. The medieval equivalent of setting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes was a noble elopement. It was political sabotage, not simply personal revolt, if you fled to marry the person of your choice. Assume you are Lady Eleanor, who was sworn to Sir Boring von Estate Secure, but you have fallen deeply in love with a destitute squire who has a subtle scent of adventure and horses. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings, and one day you vanish, off to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favor. There, a frightened monk and 2 hens are the only witnesses to your dubious legal marriage. Chaos at home. Your family is furious. Your father, threatening to enclose the family garden of the groom. Your mum, sobbing into her needlework hoop. The church is really worried. The chatter is great. Don't get too cozy if you're the groom in this romantic uprising. In the best case, you keep both your kneecaps and your bride. In the worst situation, you are disemboweled and excommunicated, respectively. However, some couples manage to get away with it, if it was impossible to terminate the union without further humiliation. Sometimes families simply let out a sigh and went on. At least no one was killed, and what's done is done. Hopefully. Occasionally, these scandals turned into folklore. At banquets, stories were whispered, poems were written, and songs were composed. 2 aristocrats who put love before duty. Almost mythical. Indeed, the majority of aristocratic weddings were commercial, But these fleeting outbursts, fervent escapes, and hushed vows under moonlit towers served as a reminder to the world that love, whatever its inconveniences, would not die. Just keep in mind that at least your love life doesn't entail secret weddings, irate barons, and a horse tethered to a ladder outside your window if you ever feel dramatic about swiping left or declining a second date. Marriage. Their individual financial portfolios and that lovely marriage of two spirits. Because love was pleasant in the Middle Ages, but a dowry, that was really romantic. Suppose you are getting married, you're being launched like a little economic vessel with a dowry rather than just being married. Depending on how lovable they believe you are, your family prepares your dowry, money, land, animals, linens, a cow or two, and perhaps even a set of pewter plates if they're feeling really giving. Your potential spouse will welcome you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator after receiving these offers. Now flip the scenario. In some cultures or regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods, it's the bride price. The groom essentially says, here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs in exchange for her family's honor in marrying her. Give me your daughter now, the best of medieval romance. The important thing is that someone is making a payment. There will undoubtedly be a receipt involved in your marriage. These interactions involve status, expectations, and public declarations in addition to money. A bride from a wealthy family may have a sizable dowry. A stingy person would imply that they were attempting to get rid of her as soon as possible, perhaps as a result of questionable personality qualities or a tendency to respond negatively. Typically, you, the bride, were not allowed to keep your dowry. Within the first month of marriage, it was controlled by your spouse, protected by the law, and, ideally, not squandered on dice and ale. It became a part of the home economy. Theoretically, you may get your dowry back if the marriage terminated due to death, annulment, or your husband leaving to become a monastery after experiencing midlife remorse. However, getting it back was frequently more difficult than drawing a blade from a stone. Support, legal assistance, and ideally a reader would be necessary. If the bride price was paid, it was costly up front and there were no refunds, much like purchasing a rare goat. It made up for the loss of the bride's work to her family. Who is going to milk the sheep now, after all? Therefore, money was constantly at the altar, even though love was occasionally involved. You choose not to get married. Perhaps your dowry was suspiciously little, you were the second son, or you simply enjoyed chanting. In either case, you have joined a convent or monastery. Congratulations! You have now vowed to live a life of virginity, poverty, and a combative lack of interest in romance. But here you are, in a stone cloister, surrounded by candle smoke, solitude, and the surprisingly heartfelt eyes of Brother Anselm. Yes, forbidden love managed to find a way even within the walls of a monastery. To be clear, it was strongly discouraged for members of a religious order to fall in love. For example, someone with a Latin name may lecture you, lash you, or banish you, discouraging you. Since you vowed to commit your heart to God and no one else, you must give it to Him completely. However, because hearts are erratic, prayers can occasionally sound a lot like love poetry. Perhaps it begins with innocuous activities like whispering during Vespers, giving bread to one another in the refectory, or laughing a little too loudly when someone drops a hymnal. Before you know it, you're doubting everything and stuffing extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's bag. Some nuns and monks penned fervent letters that were obviously disguised as spiritual reflections. Unless you read between the lines, the statement, "Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation," sounds sacred. And lots of people did. Unavoidably, there were scandals, clandestine gatherings in the herb garden, non-sacramental midnight confessions, and the occasional startling finding of a nun with an unusually round tummy. The penalty is typically severe: public penance, exile, or being transferred to a remote abbey that is primarily noted for its stillness and sheep. Not all tales, however, ended in shame. A few lovers managed to get away. After being defrocked, some even got married. However, the majority went back to their cloisters, red-faced and resolute, vowing that the entire situation was nothing more than an overheated religious argument, because discipline was the ultimate goal of monastic life. However, even when they are silent and wearing robes, humans are still humans. And sometimes there was more excitement in a silent glance across the chapel than in any courtly sonnet or tournament. You did it, you got married. Someone poured mead over your mother's only decent cloak, there was a priest, and there was a pig roast. However, now that a few months or years have passed, something feels away. Your spouse may be snoring like a dying lute. Perhaps they neglected to disclose their long-term gambling issue, or perhaps you've recently come to the realization that romantic joy isn't always the outcome of marriage for land and sheep. In any case, welcome to the realm of unhappy medieval marriages. There are no divorce papers, so don't go looking for them. Not in any shape you'd recognize anyway. God had sealed marriage, the church had approved it, and public humiliation had enforced it as a sacred and unbreakable connection. You would need a very compelling basis to attempt an annulment. It's not enough that we don't get along. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often. Or, best case scenario, never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that fact. In writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. It becomes more messy if you're a noble. Your marriage was political as much as personal. Attempting to avoid it could lead to a small-scale conflict, a scandal, or a feud. It's best to attend different feasts and secretly detest each other. What then do dissatisfied spouses do? They merely endure for the most part. You sleep in different beds, you moan loudly while eating, you express your emotions through embroidery, or that one psalm that makes you feel so angry. Your love language becomes passive aggression. Naturally, affairs took place, sometimes in a spectacular way, but typically in a quiet way. Peasants had strangely helpful neighbors, and nobles had hidden lovers. Naturally, the church denounced it, but that didn't deter anyone. They simply became more adept at skulking around barns and attributing events to God's enigmatic will. It was particularly difficult for women to leave a terrible marriage. Society expected you to be faithful, quiet, and somewhat religious despite surviving on bread crusts and criticism, regardless of whether your husband was violent or disappeared. Some managed to make it work, though. Marriages weren't always joyous, but they might develop into partnerships through shared experiences, lugging firewood in the rain, hardship and habit. Suppose your spouse passes away. Perhaps the pandemic was to blame, an agricultural accident perhaps. Maybe they tripped over a goose in the dark. You are now a widow, regardless of how it happened. All of a sudden, the medieval dating pool becomes available once more. In the Middle Ages, it was strangely freeing to be a widow. More freedom than you had previously, yet not liberated enough to do as you please. Widowhood frequently gave women in particular a taste of independence, land management, decision-making, and even public speaking, without being instantly shunned. Additionally, you could be married again fairly fast if you were still young and had teeth. There were times of mourning, yet survival instincts also existed. A widow was essentially a walking treasure trove if she had land and no husband. With frightening rapidity, suitors showed up. Some were sincere, while others were just overly excited about your dairy cows. Society essentially forces men who have just lost a spouse to get married again. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking. Maybe the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow who always brings suspiciously good mead to market. Second marriages can have surprisingly wonderful romance. You're older and wiser this time. No alliance is being forced upon you. You're choosing someone to survive with, maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. There were rules, of course. Remarrying too soon was frowned upon by the church. For example, your partner isn't yet cold. Additionally, widows frequently had to bargain with relatives about inheritance and dowries. Arguing with your brother-in-law about who gets to retain the butter churn is the epitome of a romantic second chance. Second marriages were nevertheless usual, if not anticipated. Life wasn't long, the winters were long. If they didn't have to, nobody wanted to spend them by themselves. Indeed, love played a role, perhaps the quiet sort, founded on respect for one another, shared tales, and the knowledge that you had both already witnessed some things rather than the swooning, sonnet-writing kind. So you pour the soup, ignite the fire, and give it another go. Because it's human, not because it's flawless. Despite the contracts, courtships, chaperones, and perhaps a spectacular barn elopement, you've made it this far. But ask yourself the most archaic question of all, before you fall in love with someone fresh. Can you love this person in a cosmic way? Because love was more than simply a question of the heart throughout the Middle Ages. Stars, bones, and whether your grandmother saw a fox this morning were all at stake. First, let's talk about astrology. Yes, you might want to speak with the local monk astrologer before kissing anyone. Do your signage work together? Is Venus backwards? Was the moon unlucky when your beloved was born? If so, it would be wiser to wed a less cursed person. Without planetary interference, love is difficult enough. Then there were birthmarks, enigmatic tiny signals that may reveal you were the long-lost twin of your sweetheart or their chosen executioner. That was the flexibility of superstitions. However, the church had a checklist of its own. Unless you got special permission, which the affluent sometimes obtained due to loopholes, you were not allowed to marry your cousin, your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed. You would therefore likely need to sketch a family tree before things became serious, then covertly remove portions of it. Social standing was also very important. It would be considered either a miracle or a moral failure for a noble to fall in love with a peasant. Romance between classes was uncommon, scandalous, and only permitted if it turned into a sad folk ballad. The omens came after that. A negative sign would be if a raven passed overhead when you were thinking about someone. Forget about dropping bread during supper while staring at your crush. That union is doomed. To undermine your chances or shield you from unsuitable suitors, someone can place a charm under your door. Both were effective. In this universe, love was more than just a personal affair. It had a mysterious quality. Everybody had a viewpoint. The weather, the saints, the stars, and that one woman in the woods who was most likely a witch but was unquestionably not. But people continued to love in spite of all the signs, regulations, and hushed cautions, bravely, awkwardly, and frequently against advice, because the heart is still gloriously disobedient, whether it is medieval or not. Alexander the Great is most likely someone you've heard of. Julius Caesar, perhaps. However, are you familiar with the woman who supposedly severed Cyrus the Great's head and dipped it in blood? She was Tomyris, and she did not sit on a gold-plated throne or in a city with towering walls. No, her army was the wind, her court was the open sky, and her power came from unquestionable, unadulterated authority rather than titles. She ruled as queen of the Massagetae, a group of wandering tribes that inhabited Central Asia's steppes. Imagine ritual feasts, soldiers with tattoos, horse archers, and justice on the battlefield. Tomyris's authority was not inherited from a system of pampered courtiers. Grit, leadership, and perhaps a healthy amount of don't-mess-with-me energy were the reasons behind her success. Her people were hardy, used to long travels, severe winters, and adversaries on all sides. She was unique, though, even among these individuals. In her own right, she was a warrior, a legislator, and a monarch. No brother led her hand, and no husband overshadowed her. To be clear, Herodotus, a Greek historian who was not exactly known for rigorous fact-checking, is largely responsible for what we know about Tomyris. Tomyris was more than just a queen, though, if even a small portion of his story is accurate. She was a storm in human form. This is essential to her story. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, ruled by Cyrus the Great, was a foreign powerhouse that was becoming more powerful every day. He had already vanquished Babylon and Lydia, and now he looked east. Next on his list were the Massagetae. However, Cyrus was unsure of the type of woman he was interacting with. Tomyris was already getting ready for war before the first spear broke, before the first arrow flew, and before her son's passing altered everything. She refused to submit, not because she desired conquest. She was protecting a way of life, not simply a piece of land. You just don't invade some queens, as Cyrus would soon discover. There was a reputation for Cyrus the Great, the kind of man who could go into ancient cities, overthrow empires, and still be remembered favorably by historians. He was not just any king, he was a conqueror's conqueror. He therefore didn't precisely anticipate opposition as he turned to face the Massagetae's homeland to the east. Who, after all, could refuse the guy who had captured Babylon with virtually little effort? Since any competent imperialist begins with a grin, Cyrus made the first offer in a kind manner. He suggested that he and Tomyris be married politically. That's romantic, you may think. Tomyris, however, saw through it. She realized that this had nothing to do with alliance or even love. It has to do with control. She would become a trophy queen, and her realm would become just another province of the Persian Empire if she married Cyrus. She firmly refused. It was not well received by Cyrus, who was not used to being rejected. He would forcibly seize her realm if he couldn't entice her to submit. He established a foothold after crossing the Araxes River, which divided his dominion from the Massagetae's territory. Tomyris, however, wasn't idle. She assembled her men, conferred with her chiefs, and readied herself for the impending fight. The bait then appeared. Cyrus set up a trap with the help of his general Harpagus. With a sumptuous camp brimming with food and wine, luxuries that nomads seldom enjoyed, he left a section of his soldiers behind. Spagapaises, Tomyris's son, headed a detachment to look into it. They broke into the camp, stole the wine, and drank it to death. It was the perfect time for the Persians to return. Overwhelmed, Spagapaises and his troops were drunk, confused, and unprepared. He was taken alive. Tomyris's world fell apart upon hearing the news. This was not merely a military defeat. It was intimate. Her heir, her son, was now in Persian captivity. She wrote Cyrus a message. "Return my boy to me and go. I swear by the sun, the Massagetae's master, that I will give you your share of blood if you don't." Cyrus paid no attention. Embarrassed by his captivity, Spagapaises committed suicide while being held captive by the Persians. After losing her only son, Tomyris was now seeking blood. Grief is a strong emotion, but anger combined with grief, that is the formula for complete destruction. Something inside Tomyris exploded when she found out that her son, Spagapaises, had committed suicide while in Persian captivity. Borders, pride, or even independence were no longer relevant in this situation. This was a war of retaliation. Tomyris also didn't want to mourn in silence. She did not weep by the fire or go to her tent in mourning garments. Instead, she honed her swords, mounted her horse, and took an oath that would live on in history. After defeating Cyrus in combat, she would ensure that he would always remember her name even after he passed away. Herodotus claims that Tomyris called a meeting of her tribal council. She commanded the mobilization of the Massagetae. Imagine it. On horseback, hundreds of warriors decked out in rage. They moved like a storm, quick, chaotic, and deadly precise, rather than marching like a Persian army. She laid the trap this time. Perhaps overconfident after his previous deception, Cyrus misjudged her determination. However, Tomyris was now aware of his strategy. She observed how he moved, waited for the ideal opportunity, and then let loose. According to Herodotus, the conflict between the two armies was one of the bloodiest in ancient history. There were only yelling horses, clashing blades, and a queen who battled with her warriors. No elaborate formations or lengthy speeches, no emperor in silk robes here. In the midst of it all, Tomyris was riding hard and ruthlessly destroying foes, and Cyrus the Great was dead after all was said and done. He had his body searched by Tomyris, who was always dramatic in her punishment. His head was cut off, put in a blood-soaked wineskin, and offered as a last sacrifice. Herodotus claims that she spoke to it. You have had enough blood to quench your thirst. Whether or not all of the details are accurate is essentially irrelevant, because Tomyris' victory is what counts. She avenged her son, overthrew the most powerful empire of her era, and ensured that her name would be remembered as a conqueror rather than a sufferer. And this was only the beginning of her legend. The Persians were either dead or running, their mythical king was dead in the soil, and the battlefield was quiet. What about Tomyris? She didn't carve her face into coins, parade through Persepolis, or revel like a conqueror. Rather, she stood over Cyrus's body, her heart still broken, but her wrath satisfied. Peace, it turned out, did not follow victory. In addition to winning a war, the Massagetae had changed the course of empire. The ancient world was rocked by Cyrus the Great's passing. Rumors circulated in Egypt, Babylon, and the furthest reaches of the Persian Empire. A nomadic queen with no palace or throne, but only rage, grit, and a cavalry of men who would ride into hell for her, had overthrown the irresistible king, not another powerful kingdom. However, Tomyris refrained from using her triumph as a means of conquest. She returned to her people without any imperial aspirations or war taxes, just as pragmatically as she had ruled. That wasn't her world, so she didn't attempt to take the crown. Her son had been avenged, and she had received justice. Even if the empire could carry on without Cyrus, it would now reconsider ever riding east again. It's important to note how uncommon this was. Most monarchs would have seized control with both hands after winning a fight of that size. However, Tomyris appeared more focused on maintaining the independence of her people than on extending her influence. However, this is where her story starts to lose its impact. She was not mentioned in any documents following the fight, and there are no statues, royal tombs, or stone monuments honoring Massagetae. As elusive and wild as the steppes itself, she rides into the mists of history. Whether Herodotus embellished her story or not is up for contention among historians. Some claim that the wineskin of blood was a work of poetic fiction, and that Cyrus died somewhere else. Even skeptics, however, concur that someone struck Persia a serious blow. It was a queen, a mother, and a woman whose love for her son drove one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient history. It wasn't a king or a general. Additionally, her story was borne by the wind and didn't need to be written down, because some people still believe that the wind whispers her name, Tomyris, as it howls across the steppe. You must comprehend Tomyris's followers in order to comprehend her. The Massagetae were not like other ancient societies. No scrolls of poetry, no hanging gardens, no marble temples. They lived in the vast, wild regions east of the Caspian Sea, too untamed for Babylonian scribes or Persian satraps, and were a nomadic warrior civilization. They lived in a world of mobility, survival, and dignity. Imagine warriors born on horseback, vast, borderless plains, and herds of cattle and horses as money. Before they were able to walk normally, children were taught to ride. Archery was instinctive, it wasn't a sport. Their bows were little yet lethal. Their armor, layers of scale and leather that are strong for battle and flexible for riding. To defend their independence, they hunted, raided, and engaged in combat. Additionally, Massagetae women were able to and did engage in combat, in contrast to many patriarchal communities of the era. It was anticipated, not an exception. Warrior women were your neighbors, not myths. Therefore, nobody objected when Tomyris brandished a sword and led her people into combat. She wasn't breaking the rules or posing as a man, just sharper, smarter, and far more deadly than others. She was the norm. Both justice and strength were prized in their society. The penalties for crimes were severe, yet just. In many respects, property was shared. Loyalty to the tribe and the capacity to protect it were what were important. Yes, kings and queens ruled, but not by oppression, but by consensus. Leaders had to demonstrate their worth by their actions rather than their ancestry. In terms of religion, they worshipped the sun. The sun, the Massagetae's master, swore by Tomyris in her well-known warning to Cyrus. The sun, the almighty arbiter of all vows, was life, light, and justice. Breaking a promise was like to spitting in the face of the sky. To put it briefly, Tomyris was not an exception. Rather, she was the perfect representation of her people, fierce, moral, and arrogant. She became powerful because she was the precise type of leader that the Massagetae admired, not because she was a woman. The Massagetae possessed freedom, whereas the Persians had bureaucracy, and in one bloody, historic conflict, that freedom prevailed. Because capitulation is just not an option when you're from a place where the wind never stops and the sky is your only ceiling. Do you know what's odd? One individual, Herodotus, is responsible for everything we know about Tomyris, including her conflict with Cyrus, the loss of her son, and the blood-soaked wineskin. Herodotus is frequently referred to as the father of history, which is fantastic until you consider that he is also the originator of myth, hearsay, and theatrical flair. The man enjoyed a good narrative, and it was even better if it included gory retaliation, divine omens, or queens pushing heads into blood. How much of Tomyris's story is real then? Whether you believe a Greek who wrote decades after the events and likely never met a Massagetae in his life depends on your level of trust. Herodotus depended on first-hand recollections, stories from travelers, and any rumors that were circulating within the Persian kingdom. For him, history was a performance rather than only a record. But here's the thing, he decided to share her tale. Herodotus made a point of highlighting a steppe queen who overthrew one of the greatest kings in history in a society full with male tyrants, warlords, and kings. Let's zoom out, but that's not nothing. Why was this story so popular? Easy. It had everything. A valiant woman, a tragic son, a crafty adversary, a death-defying conflict, and a graphic conclusion fit for any Greek tragedy. If a traveling bard told you this story while you were in Athens or Thebes, you would never forget Tomyris. She won because she dared to challenge a superpower, not because she wore a crown. And her story changed over time. She was portrayed in medieval chronicles as a barbaric Amazon. She was shown by Renaissance artists clutching Cyrus's skull like a prize while covered in blood. She was iconic, exotic, and intimidating. Something authentic, however, endures in her mythology despite all the retellings. The story's essential elements, the queen, the sun, the conflict, and the triumph, feel too particular and relatable to be purely fictional, even if it isn't the exact dialogue or the wineskin. Herodotus ultimately mythologized Tomyris rather than merely preserving her. And because history remembers revenge but forgets generals, that may make it difficult to distinguish fact from fiction, but it also guaranteed that her name would endure far longer than Cyrus's imperial decrees. For more than 2 millennia, Tomyris has occupied the imagination of civilizations, despite the fact that she is a queen who has no surviving monuments. She was revered by Renaissance painters. She was an ideal dramatic muse for a canvas's gory finale. In 1622, as courtiers watched in wonder, Rubens depicted her clutching a severed head in a composed manner. In another, she is depicted standing calmly and majestically, while Cyrus's severed head is ceremoniously dipped into a golden cup filled with blood. Stylish? Perhaps not. Remarkable? Of course. Tomyris was more than just a historical figure to European painters. Depending on who was wielding the brush, she was a feminist icon, a feral noble, a cautionary tale, or a woman who punished pride. She was symbolic, personified. She might stand for the wisdom of a monarch who refused to be bought, the savagery of the East, or the righteous rage of a mother. She was also adored by writers. She made appearances in plays, novels, and philosophical tracts between the 18th and 19th centuries. Thinkers of the Enlightenment argued about whether she was evidence that women could lead effectively, or a warning about what happens when emotions take over. In any case, she continued to be published. Ironically, however, there are no records of her own people. Later, nomadic cultures either assimilated or eradicated the Massagetae, causing it to disappear from history. There were no gold-plated burial mounds or carved inscriptions stating Tomyris was present. She continued to resurface despite the fact that her memory was only preserved by outside observers. Tomyris was reclaimed as a symbol of anti-imperialist resistance in Central Asia during the Soviet era. In Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, statues of her have been placed. She was re-evaluated by contemporary scholars as a genuine head of state, a woman who reigned, led armies, and negotiated from a position of strength, rather than as a ruthless barbarian. She has made appearances in video games and documentaries. She can be a playable leader in a strategy game in a split second. In the next, scholarly journals that focus on gender and power are analyzing her. Range is that. The odd part comes next. We have yet to learn her exact appearance, not a single coin, bust, or engraving, but we are aware of her values, power, retribution, independence, legacy. Tomyris is remembered because she did not behave in a world that forgets queens who do. She didn't request to be included in the gallery of historical art. Posing for the bloodiest portrait ever drawn, she kicked down the door. The practice of women leading troops into combat was not unique to Tomyris. She wasn't the last either. However, women like her are typically viewed as exceptions throughout history. Isolated moments of strength in a man's life. The reality? Tomyris belonged to an extensive, frequently disregarded family of female rulers. Let's go back a little. Before Tomyris, there was Shemuramat, the Assyrian queen who might have served as the model for the legendary Semiramis, a city builder and rebel slayer. The Scythians, who are the Massagetae's cultural relatives, buried female soldiers with weapons and skeletons that were obviously damaged in combat during the same time period. These positions weren't ceremonial. On horseback, these ladies battled, suffered, and lost their lives. Tomyris was followed by more. She is frequently linked to Boudica, the Celtic queen who spearheaded a bloody uprising against the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE. Similar to Tomyris, personal loss served as the catalyst for Boudica's conflict. Her land was taken, and her daughters were beaten. What did she say? She reduced Roman towns to ashes. The similarities are striking. An empire too conceited to recognize what was coming, grief and retaliation. Another is Zenobia, the queen of Palmyra, who established her own little empire in the east in the 3rd century CE, defying even Rome. She forced the emperor to visit her, declared independence, and struck coins with her visage. Tomyris and all of these women are united by their audacity rather than their power. They were in charge at times when it was assumed that males should be in charge. They ruled as generals, strategists, and kings rather than as guardians or substitutes. Furthermore, these women were frequently called dangerous, strange, and barbaric, although many male commanders received accolades for their victories. Why? Since they prevailed. Tomyris wasn't an anomaly. Rather, she was a part of a centuries-old global trend of women who stood up to rulers and caused them to bleed. Her tale, which has been preserved by Greek writers and contemporary imagination, serves as a reminder that although it was rarely documented, female leadership was not uncommon. Imagine a queen riding a horse with a bow in her hand and blood in her eyes when you think of ancient battle. She wasn't alone. She was one of the few that they couldn't destroy. There is no big tomb, no preserved armor, no marble bust in a museum, no golden inscriptions or dynasty walls, and Tomyris never constructed a palace. Nevertheless, she perseveres. Her legacy is paradoxical in many respects. Her entire narrative is predicated on a few, skewed, and perhaps fictitious passages from Herodotus. However, a seed that would not die was sown by those words. Her name has come up often throughout the course of more than 2 millennia, when the world needed to remind itself that authority isn't necessarily accompanied by a crown or a beard. Numerous perspectives have been used to reimagine her. She was a warning to tyrants and the noble barbarian in Renaissance Europe. She rose to fame in contemporary Central Asia as a folk hero, a representation of defiance and patriotism, particularly in nations still dealing with the effects of colonialism and imperialism. Beyond symbolism and myth, there is something distinctly human about her narrative. Statues depicting her ascent from Kazakhstani plazas, youngsters learning her name in school books, and politicians quoting her when expressing strength and independence. It is the story of a mother who lost her son, a commander who had to decide between surviving and surrendering, and a person who decided to fight and prevailed when confronted by one of the most powerful nations in history. Tomyris endures like a blade buried just below the surface, ready to be resurrected by a new generation, eager for tales of wild resistance in a world that frequently erases the identities of warrior women. She serves as a reminder that history includes more than just monarchs and empires. It also includes mothers and queens, sorrow and retaliation, blood and dirt. It's the quiet moments following combat when a woman stands by herself in a field full of dead people, knowing that she has altered the course of history, but that no one will ever believe her. Her unwillingness to be forgotten may be her greatest legacy. No issue, no statues. Her mythology still echoes the warning, "Come for me and you'll drink your fill of blood." And her name continues to float on the wind of the steppes and make emperors appear mortal. So keep that in mind the next time you hear of the collapse of a great king. Sometimes a queen on horseback, lost to history but never really gone, delivers the decisive stroke instead of an opposing empire. Imagine living in a world where your front door opens to the sky, your roof is stitched from hide, and your walls are constructed of felt. There is only the sound of hoofs, the whisper of grass, and the constantly shifting sky. No cities, no farms, no stone monuments to be passed on to the future. Mobility was strength for ancient nomadic societies, and permanence was a myth. Without leaving a single marble temple behind, ancient nomads formed vast civilizations from the Arabian deserts to the Eurasian steppes. With the help of the seasons, their herds' grazing habits, and a thorough knowledge of the terrain, these were strategic movers rather than aimless nomads. They lived in foldable fortresses made for a nomadic lifestyle, such as yurts, tents, or wheeled wagons. The mainstays of nomadic existence were horses, sheep, goats, and cattle. Livestock, not land, was the measure of a person's wealth. Horses served as status symbols, weapons, and companions in addition to being tools. Riding well meant surviving, and riding well meant ruling. However, mobility did not equate to disarray. The social structures of nomadic societies were intricate. Clans and tribes typically held the reins of power, and influence and merit rather than rigid inheritance were frequently used to choose leadership. A chief or khan may ascend via charisma, oratory prowess, or military genius. Loyalty was acquired on wind-swept battlefields and at campfire councils. It was personal. Furthermore, nomads were its ties to the outside world rather than its isolation. They transported slaves from Europe, silver from Persia, spices from India, and silk from China. Long before empires were popular, the first transcontinental couriers were nomadic traders and caravans. And they raided quickly, strategically, and terrifyingly effectively when trade collapsed. Their history was spoken, sung, and remembered rather than being inscribed on stone. Elders used oral tradition to transmit rules and legends. One bard or elder may carry the entire identity, history, and legal system of a tribe in their head. Stories served as identity, governance, and education rather than amusement. Empires viewed nomads as dangerous, strange, and unpredictable. To themselves, however, they were heirs to the wind, masters of adaptation, and defenders of freedom. Each time they rode, they changed the world, leaving behind only a few ruins. The Scythians ruled the windswept steppe long before the Mongols roared across Eurasia. These wandering warriors ruled over the regions from the Black Sea to the borders of Central Asia during the 9th and 2nd centuries BCE. They were exotic barbarians and formidable horsemen to the Greeks. They saw themselves as a people of pride, freedom, and retribution. The foundation of Scythian society was violence and migration. Their weaponry were useful and lethal, and their horse culture was unparalleled. Boys learnt to ride before they could walk properly. Iron-tipped spears, war axes, curved swords, and short composite bows, all perfect for firing while galloping at full speed. Nor was the Scythian warrior merely a man. What Herodotus suggested is confirmed by archaeological discoveries. Women also engaged in combat. Female skeletons with weapons interred in certain tombs display war wounds that could only have resulted from actual conflict. Although they did not construct towns, their heritage has been maintained through their kurgans, or burial mounds. Archaeologists have discovered gold, elaborate weapons, embroidered clothing, and detailed tattoos on preserved flesh beneath these mounds. A life devoted to the hunt and the natural world is reflected in their art, which is replete with whirling animals and symbols of predators. However, the Scythians were more than just untamed bandits. Particularly with Greek colonies along the Black Sea, they were traders, mercenaries, and ambassadors. They imported wine, ceramics, and luxury items in exchange for selling grain, furs, and slaves. They were feared and admired by Greek writers. Herodotus described their peculiar practices, such as using scalps as towels or drinking the blood of foes, but he also commended their fairness and kinship loyalty. They practiced animism and a primitive religion. They worshipped fertility, fire, and war gods. Horse sacrifice was used in some ceremonies, while cannabis smoke was used in others. Their perspective was cyclical and connected to the land, not in the sense of possession, but rather in the sense of divine movement. They eventually faded. The Scythians vanished into history as a result of pressure from other nomadic people like thee and being surrounded by expanding empires. However, they established the norm for the archetype of the steppe warrior, a nomadic, lethal, fiercely autonomous warrior without a master or permanent residence. They were not authors. However, the shadow cast by a mounted archer against the steppe is Scythian. Before the empire, they were the storm. The Bedouins left their mark on the dunes, while the Scythians dominated the grasslands. The Bedouin, who originated in the Arabian Peninsula's immense deserts, were more than just nomads. They were survival engineers who had mastered some of the world's most hostile landscapes. The Bedouin way of life was more subdued and methodical than the stoic clamor of steppe nomads. It was constructed with the desert's rhythms in mind: rainfall and drought, grazing paths and star movements. The black goat hair tent, also known as the beetle shah, served as their house because it was lightweight, breathable, and simple to transport. Camels are the ships of the desert, and life traveled with them. At the same time, camels served as food, clothes, transportation, and money. The tribal structure of the Bedouin was well known. The clan dominated everything. Family loyalty was paramount. Honor, or sheriff, was the social bond, not merely a term. Giving generously to guests karam was just as sacred as launching a blood feud with a single insult. For 3 days, the stranger could count on food, water, and safety without any questions. Their combat was based on raids, or gazu, which were quick, calculated attacks intended to seize animals and supplies without causing needless deaths. The goals of battle were honor, reputation, and survival, rather than mass murder. A man's status was raised after a successful raid. For generations, a failed one may damage a tribe's reputation. But there was more to Bedouin life than strife and sandstorms. Oral tradition was abundant. Poets were soldiers of words. Their poetry honored heroes, humiliated foes, and preserved history. Poetry was passed down from person to person and was frequently recited around the fire in a rhythmic manner. While some poetry became legacy, others became tribal lore. Bedouin regions were often traversed by trade caravans. These tribesmen transported products from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond, including silk, spices, and incense. They also acted as guides, guardians, and occasionally smugglers. They were familiar with every star route and oasis. Their expertise was costly and famous. Despite their eventual assimilation into cities and empires, many Bedouins remained fiercely independent. Tribal rules and the black tent are still emblems of Bedouin identity today. They were the spirit of the desert, not merely its survivors. The Mongols are the only nomadic people who have ever changed the course of history. These steppe warriors emerged from Mongolia's grasslands in the 13th century, creating the world's greatest contiguous land empire. However, their roots were fluid, clan-based, and extremely adaptive, just like the other nomadic societies they followed. The steppes of Mongolia were harsh and hard. The Mongols inhabited gurs, which were round felt tents that could be assembled in less than an hour and loaded onto a cart the following day. They were supported by their goats, yaks, horses, and herds, and their offspring were brought up in saddles. Learning to ride came before learning to read and write. The majority of Mongols were actually illiterate, although they were not required to be. They stored their information in memory, proverbs, and songs. The Mongols were unique in that they used mobility as a weapon. Tribal divisions were broken down and restructured into a new, merit-based system under Genghis Khan. The world changed when allegiance to the Khan took the place of allegiance to the tribe. Mongol combat was a deceptive and swift ballet. Their horse archers could go more than 100 miles a day, travel at full speed, and fire accurately while feigning retreats to entice adversaries. However, they were strategists as well as raiders. With horrifying accuracy, they employed psychological warfare, signal flags, spies, and scouts. They swiftly adjusted as they started capturing cities. They were joined by siege engineers from Persia and China. The Mongols acquired the skills necessary to construct battering rams, flaming arrows, and catapults, and employed them with terrifying effectiveness. Here's the twist, though: they were more than just annihilators. The Mongol Empire established unprecedented global connections. They ensured secure travel from China to Europe by reviving and safeguarding the Silk Road. Their extensive network carried goods, concepts, and even illnesses like the Black Death. They established passport systems, paper money, and religious tolerance throughout their empire. Under Mongol authority, a Buddhist monk, a Christian priest, and a Muslim merchant could all travel without risk as long as they didn't rebel. But at their core, they were still nomads. Mongol monarchs continued to return to their tents, herds, and the open steppe despite ruling entire empires. Because they always rode with the wind at their backs, regardless of how high they rose, they conquered cities, yet never really belonged there. Nomads were either helpful or hazardous to the sedentary empires, and occasionally both at once. However, the distinction between raid and trade was a matter of negotiation for nomads. They would one day lead your caravans through the desert. They would pillage your border towns the next day. How well you were paid and the season determined everything. Nomadic life depended heavily on trade. Most nomads were unable to cultivate crops or create ceramics. They required luxury items, textiles, equipment, and spices. They traded salt, leather, furs, animals, and unusual goods like rare horses or falcons. A few engaged in direct trade with empires. Others served as intermediaries between far-flung areas, creating vital connections via the incense route, Silk Road, and other transcontinental routes. These were no ordinary commercial caravans, however. Armed convoys, they were prepared to attack or defend themselves as needed. One week, a tribal chief may engage in negotiations with a border governor, and the next week, he may plunder his storehouses. Empires referred to this as betrayal. Nomads referred to it as choices. For instance, the Scythians traded gold and grain with Greek cities around the Black Sea, but they would burn the goods of any city that attempted to defraud them. Throughout Arabia, the Bedouins guarded caravans carrying spices and incense. The camels altered course unless someone didn't pay protection fees. Genghis Khan's Mongols first attempted to engage in peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire, but after their merchants were put to death, they destroyed large cities in retaliation. Trade was political and personal to the nomadic people. It was an expression of respect, not simply business. Trade flourished in sedentary kingdoms where the nomads were considered as equals. Punishment for disrespecting them was severe and typically carried out on horseback. A peculiar relationship resulted from this strain. Economies at the border, cities and towns bordering hybrid areas, half market, half military outpost. Chieftains were bought off by governors. Tribes exchanged intelligence, news, and horses. Marriages were occasionally arranged to maintain shaky peace. Nomadic existence was not flawed by this balancing act between raid and trade. It had a feature. They were able to influence empires without constructing them, negotiate power without invading land, and maintain their flexibility in a society that revered walls. Conquering cities was not necessary for them. All they needed were cities to keep an eye on the horizon. How do you preserve your history in a world without printing machines, libraries, or scrolls? The solution was straightforward and immensely potent for nomadic societies. You recall it. Ancient nomads used oral tradition for more than just telling stories. It was a combination of their constitution, courts, library, and mythology. The tongue was sharper than the sword, and memory was revered everywhere from the Scythian grasslands to the Mongol plains and the Bedouin deserts. Elders were more than just elderly people. They were human-like archives. They were familiar with proverbs that influenced decisions in both peace and conflict, war tales that molded tribal identity, and lineages dating back a dozen generations. These were not humorous campfire stories. These were laws, cautions, and teachings. Poetry reigned supreme among the Bedouins. A well-written poem has the power to honor a fallen warrior, humiliate an adversary, or resolve a conflict. Tribal chiefs were advised by poets, or sher, who were more vividly recalled than many chiefs. Their recall was perfect, and their words had the power to either start or end a war. Word for word, generation after generation, entire epics were transmitted. This also applied to the Mongols. Originally kept verbally, the vast book known as The Secret History of the Mongols was only subsequently recorded in writing. It describes not only Genghis Khan's ascent, but also the cultural ideals of ambition, fate, retaliation, and loyalty that shaped their society. This historical record isn't dry. Originally repeated by heart to instruct and unite, it is a living epic. Despite leaving virtually no written records, the Scythians preserved thorough oral histories of their relationships, conflicts, and migrations. Greek authors such as Herodotus were recording the echoes of an even older oral tradition when they recounted their stories. History was not etched in stone, but rather transmitted through campfires. There were dangers to oral tradition. Stories changed, memories dimmed. However, it also had a huge advantage. It survived. It was deeply human, flexible, and adaptive. Even after migrations, defeats, or cultural assimilation, it enabled nomadic societies to maintain their individuality. Nomadic legends endured because they were woven into breath rather than being recorded in writing, even after empires fell and their archives were reduced to dust. And nothing was really lost as long as someone remembers. Women were veiled, kept in the background, or kept behind the walls of palaces in many ancient societies. In nomadic societies, however, the situation was frequently quite different. Since everyone was working while on the go, women also wielded authority. Historical and archaeological evidence demonstrates that nomadic women, from the Scythians to the Mongols, were more than just wives and mothers. They served as ambassadors, shamans, riders, warriors, and clan chiefs. There was no time for idle hands in a life on the go. Regardless of gender, all community members had to help with governance, battle, and survival. For instance, the Scythians. Women have been found buried wearing armor, swords, and arrows at burial sites throughout the Eurasian steppe, and their bones display signs of battle-related injuries. These graves were not symbolic. These ladies engaged in combat. Greek historians created whole stories about Amazons because they were so fascinated and afraid of them. These wandering tribes are said to have produced fierce warrior women. While the males were out raiding or conquering, women ran the encampments in Mongol civilization. However, women made their imprint even at the highest levels of authority. Daughters and daughters-in-law of Genghis Khan frequently held military positions, governed kingdoms, and engaged in diplomacy. Sorghaghtani Beki, one of the most influential women in Mongol history, was a kingmaker and strategist who forged alliances and produced monarchs. Despite having fewer positions of public leadership, women in the Bedouin community nevertheless held sway through poetry, familial ties, and hospitality customs. The domain of a woman was her tent. She was a key character in tribal life because of her capacity to oversee resources, maintain honor, and produce future warriors. Some tribes allowed women to control property, start divorces, and even possess camels, which are the ultimate emblem of survival and riches. Nomadic women were also endowed with spiritual influence by religion. Female shamans were important healers, spirit guides, and preservers of traditional knowledge in several Turkic and Siberian steppe communities. They weren't mystics from the edge. They were regarded as important members of the community. To put it briefly, mobility led to necessity, and necessity in turn led to equality, at least more so than in the majority of empires at that era. Flexibility was necessary due to the uncertain nature of nomadic living. Women stepped up without fanfare or permission if a male was killed in combat. A woman might be the hand that pulled the bow and the hand that rocked the cradle in these swaying communities. Spirituality was not associated with temples or other places of worship for nomadic peoples. It permeated the sky, the terrain, and the actual travel. Your gods accompany you on your journey through life. Animistic and nature-based nomadic belief systems were usually centered on animal behavior, seasonal cycles, and survival rhythms. The wind was a messenger, not just the weather. The mountains served as protectors. Spirits were carried via rivers. Fire was revered. Life was a conversation with the invisible. The pantheon of gods associated with nature was the focal point of worship among the Scythians, as Herodotus describes them. Papaios, the deity of the sky, and Tabete, the goddess of the hearth, who is perhaps Hestia's equal. Sacred oaths taken outside, cannabis smoke, and horse sacrifice were common rituals. They had a raw, earthy, and visceral spiritual world. Warriors and shamans appealing to the heavens, but no priests in robes. Prior to the spread of Islam, the Bedouins were polytheists who worshipped tribe idols and regional deities. Above all, however, they held in high regard the invisible, the enigmatic powers of nature and fate. It was thought that lonely spots, windstorms, and rocks were home to jinn, or spirits. It was believed that these beings inspired and occasionally even possessed poets and seers. Being hospitable was a spiritual duty, not just a tradition. Tengrism, the veneration of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, formed the foundation of Mongol spirituality. Tengri was not a temple deity to whom one offered prayers. He was the sky itself, constantly present, observing and making judgments. Genghis Khan asserted that Tengri gave him the authority to reign. In addition, the Mongols held in high regard the sacred fire in the middle of each tent, earth spirits, and ancestral ghosts. A significant part was performed by shamanism. Shamans served as political consultants, healers, and spirit guides. Nomadic spirituality was beautiful because it was flexible. Nomads frequently combined their own beliefs with those of Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others they encountered. Several religions were simultaneously supported by Mongol monarchs. A Bedouin could maintain their earlier desert-based practices while adhering to Islamic law. Nomads carried the sacred with them, whereas towns constructed temples to house the divine. Their beliefs flowed like the rivers they traversed, their ceremonies changed, and their gods relocated. For a nomad, faith only required the sky above, the earth below, and memory in between. Four walls were unnecessary. They left no cathedrals or pyramids behind. Their capitals are not shown on contemporary maps. Nevertheless, the history of old nomadic societies remains etched throughout, from the scars of invasion to the flow of trade to the languages we know today. Nomads were not a footnote to history. They were masterminds of upheaval, using migration to change entire continents. The Silk Road. It was more than just a route for spices and silk. It was a roadway constructed by hooves and kept up by nomadic tribes' local knowledge, strength, and diplomacy. East and West might never have met without them. They were feared by empires, and rightly so. The myth of urban superiority was contested by the Xiongnu, Mongols, Turks, and Scythians. Their triumphs revealed a basic reality. Monuments can be outthought by mobility. Nomads adapted where empires moved slowly. Nomads relied on speed when cities relied on fortifications. However, their impact extended beyond the military. By bringing stories, music, food, and even religion from one civilization to another, they served as cultural bridges. Chinese printing technology arrived in Persia during the Mongol era. The early Islamic world was influenced by Arab Bedouin customs, which included poetry, honor codes, language, and law. The Ottoman Empire was founded by Turkic nomads. The roads they traveled turned become vital conduits for civilization. Their spirit persisted even after their empires declined. It is evident in oral storytelling traditions, in contemporary horsemanship, and in the ideals of independence, kinship, and perseverance that continue to reverberate throughout the steppe, desert, and tundra. They also function as a warning in many respects. They serve as a reminder that no building, not even the largest empire, is everlasting. They demonstrated that boundaries could be erased by the wind and that power didn't have to be etched in stone to exist. Although they are fewer in number and frequently under pressure from contemporary borders, urbanization, and climate change, many nomadic peoples still live today. However, their descendants continue customs that predate those of most other countries. Stories that go through centuries, like horses through fog, hospitality to strangers, and respect for animals. Therefore, when studying history, pay attention to more than just the walls, temples, and thrones. Examine the space between them. The nomads resided there, and history passed through that area. America was split by geography as much as politics in the middle of the 1800s. The East was a hive of ports, factories, and cities. Over 1,100 miles of harsh terrain separated the West's untamed region of mountains, deserts, and goldfields. Traveling from New York to California required avoiding disease, bandits, and dust for weeks on a ship circling Cape Horn, or months in a wagon. Steel rail by steel rail, a direct route from coast to coast, unthinkable to some, inevitable to others, was the goal that would unite the nation. Proponents thought it could bring the Republic together, improve communication, transport armies, create new markets, and tame the wild frontier. But it would need more than ambition to build it. Money, labor, land, and political clout would all be needed. The Civil War brought forth that final phase. Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act in 1862 when the country was falling apart. Two railroad corporations, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were permitted by the law to begin construction from opposite sides of the nation. From Omaha, Nebraska, the Union Pacific would travel west. The Central Pacific would leave Sacramento, California, and head east. In the center, they would meet. Massive land concessions were provided by the government to support the building. Each company received significant loans and up to 640 acres of public land for each mile of track installed. In addition to bringing the nation together, there was a rush to seize money, territory, and even history. It was an infrastructure miracle on paper. As it turned out, it was going to rank among the most taxing building projects in American history. Workers would endure icy winters and blazing deserts, blow through mountains and cross enormous plains. To complete the task, thousands of laborers and immigrants would be brought in. Both the human cost and the rewards would be enormous. Additionally, this was not progress for the native cultures that inhabited the area, where the tracks would pierce the ground like a scar. It served as a warning. The plan still sounded like a gamble in 1862, but 7 years later, two lines would meet in the Utah desert and irrevocably alter the course of American history. The Sierra Nevada mountains presented the Central Pacific with a far more formidable obstacle right from the outset, whereas the Union Pacific had the level plains of Nebraska in front of them. These hills weren't soft. These were tall granite peaks that were vulnerable to backbreaking terrain, snowdrifts, and avalanches. And that was before the invention of dynamite. The actual wall was just 80 miles to the east when construction started in Sacramento in 1863. Every mile of track laid felt like a battle against nature itself, and the Sierras were a difficult barrier. The Central Pacific needs labor, a lot of it, to overcome this challenge. They first employed a large number of white laborers and Irish immigrants, but many of them left because they couldn't or wouldn't handle the demanding working conditions. At that point, the business started hiring Chinese immigrants as new employees. More than 10,000 Chinese laborers, or more than 80% of the Central Pacific's workforce, were working on the railroad by 1865. They experienced severe racism, lived in hazardous conditions, and received lower pay than white workers. However, their extraordinary expertise, perseverance, and discipline were invaluable. Their task was both horrifying and noble. They used only black powder and hand tools to chisel tunnels through solid rock. Tunnel number 6, the most notorious. It took over 2 years to finish. Snowdrifts grew up to 40 feet during the winter. Employees were housed in camps buried under the snow and connected by chimney-like vertical tunnels. Rock slides, explosions, and avalanches claimed the lives of dozens. Nevertheless, the line moved forward. Chinese laborers chipped away at stone inch by inch while hanging in baskets above cliffs to accelerate progress. They traveled through mountains when they couldn't get around them. They constructed wooden trestles that rose above gorges when they were unable to level the ground. Some of the riskiest and least valued labor in American history was involved. There aren't many records of specific Chinese employees. At the time, no sculptures were constructed for them. The Transcontinental dream, however, would have perished in the Sierras without their hands. The Central Pacific eventually broke out of the mountains by 1867. The desert that awaited them was flat, arid, unforgiving, and deadly. They had passed the worst. It was really a sprint to the meeting place. The Union Pacific faced its own challenge as the Central Pacific struggled with snow and granite in the west. The group set off westward from Omaha, Nebraska, across the Great Plains, a seemingly unending, flat, and surprisingly straightforward terrain. The geography wasn't the problem, though. People, politics, and power were all involved. Irish immigrants, former Union soldiers, and freedmen made up the majority of the Union Pacific's workforce. Many were post-Civil War veterans seeking stable employment. In a single day, crews may lay 2 or even 3 miles of track. Speed was made possible by the broad plains, but the laborers were also at risk from natural harshness, famine, and raids. This was native territory. For generations, the Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux had lived, hunted, and perished on these plains. And the railroad did not represent progress to them. An invasion took place. Tribal hunting grounds were directly traversed by the track. Herds of buffalo were alarmed by the engine's smoke belching. Telegraph poles and surveyors damaged sacred areas. Tribes anticipated it. Settlers, soldiers, fences, and displacement. There would inevitably be opposition. Red Cloud and other Lakota Sioux leaders led a valiant defense. They tore up tracks, raided campgrounds, and attacked surveying workers. In retaliation, the U.S. government positioned troops to secure the track and constructed forts along the route. Track layers were protected by armed soldiers during the militaristic process of building railroads. With rifles and short-lived treaties, it was a low-grade conflict. The railroad was seen by the indigenous nations as a death sentence to their way of existence. They were correct. Still, the Union Pacific moved onward, under the direction of experts like Thomas Durant, and supported by enormous federal loans. The firm installed track at a dizzying rate. Crews resided in makeshift settlements known as Hell on Wheels, which emerged overnight and vanished as quickly. Like a dust storm, the workers were followed by violence, booze, and gambling. Union Pacific had arrived in Cheyenne and was en route to Wyoming by 1867. Although the mountains were in the background, they were actually climbing a political mountain. When you're building tracks over someone else's bones, how can you bring a nation together? The answer was straightforward for the Union Pacific. Set up the track. Don't turn around. Great men in top hats and golden spikes are common symbols used to tell the story of the Transcontinental Railroad. However, what is the true story? Sweat, muscle, and pain are all poured into it. A large portion of it was supplied by individuals whose stories were buried beneath the structures, whose names were never noted, and whose graves were never documented. Chinese laborers accomplished the impossible on the Central Pacific. While tunneling into the Sierra Nevada, nearly 15,000 of them, the majority from Guangdong province, had to suffer icy temperatures, lethal explosions, and ethnic animosity. They were frequently kept in isolated, subpar camps, had no recognition, and made less money than white laborers. But they continued silently, deftly, and unrelentingly. Early doubters referred to the Chinese crews as weak and unfit, but they quickly showed themselves to be the most dependable workers on the railroad. They constructed trestles, lay rail, blasted rock, and prepared their own food, frequently maintaining a healthier lifestyle than their peers. However, none of them received invitations to the celebratory photo at Promontory Point when the final spike was driven. In the meantime, a significant section of the Union Pacific staff was composed of Irish immigrants. After surviving battle and starvation, many now had to deal with fresh threats on the plains. They drank themselves to sleep in flimsy tents, lay track at breakneck pace, and repelled invasions. Although they led difficult lives, their labor was vital. African Americans who had previously been enslaved also worked on the railroads. Some were employed as freedmen in search of better opportunities. Like the Chinese and Irish, they received little credit for their contributions. Despite being exploited, workers of color were essential. With bare hands and broken backs, this global workforce was constructing a country. Then came the supply transporters, teamsters, blacksmiths, and cooks, all of whom contributed to the continuous advancement of the vast engine of progress. There wouldn't be a golden spike without them, even though none of them were executives. We often focus on the visionaries and tycoons in the grand American tale, but dreams weren't the only thing that laid railroads. Calloused hands, underpaid men, and marginalized workers laid them. They twisted history without any assurance that they would live on. The railroad was not constructed for show, they constructed it for survival. The two railroad firms, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, had evolved beyond merely constructing rails by the late 1860s. They were engaged in a fierce race against the clock, each heading for an unseen rendezvous in the Utah Territory. However, there was no gentleman's agreement here. It was a struggle for reputation, wealth, and territory. Why is it so urgent? Due to the manner in which government subsidies operated. Each company received large loans and federal land grants for each mile of track completed. You claimed greater profit the more track you created. Given that just one set will be utilized, it was only reasonable for both sides to attempt to outbuild one another, including installing parallel lines in opposing directions. It got ridiculous. Crews worked at a dizzying pace. After defeating the Sierra Nevada, the Central Pacific now roared into the deserts of Nevada and Utah. The Union Pacific, meanwhile, avoided the edge of the Rocky Mountains by traversing rivers and high plains. To get funds, they even started constructing track through locations they knew the government would eventually deem unnecessary. Work reached almost insane levels of intensity. In April 1869, the Chinese crews of the Central Pacific achieved a world record. 10 miles of track were constructed in a single day, which is still an unprecedented accomplishment. They used rotating shifts, coordinated teams, and a rhythm developed over years of work to achieve this. Despite continuous labor strikes, supply problems, and poor management by their funder, Thomas Durant, who was more interested in stock manipulation than railroad building, Union Pacific crews, determined to be outdone, pushed hard from the east. At Promontory Summit in modern-day Utah, the two lines eventually came closer to one another. The site was marked by surveyors. Plans for a formal ceremony were arranged. Union Pacific's No. 119 and Central Pacific's Jupiter locomotives were placed together, cowcatcher to cowcatcher. Speeches were prepared by executives. A unique golden spike was ordered. To broadcast the last hammer blows in real time throughout the nation, telegraph cables were connected. However, the lingering reality was hidden behind the celebration. The race had been vicious, frequently careless, and solely motivated by financial gain. Even if the railroads were now connected, generations would still be affected by the damage they caused to the land, labor, and lives. Both businesses were prepared to do whatever it took to get to the finish line of progress. The American universe was centered on the wind-swept grasslands of Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869. Workers, government representatives, reporters, and railroad executives flocked to see the historic union of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. On the completed track, two shining locomotives Jupiter of the Central Pacific and number 119 of the Union Pacific stood nose to nose. A last track ran between them, with a golden spike in the middle that had the inscription, "May God continue to unite our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world." The ceremonial hammer had been linked to telegraph lines. Every strike would transmit an electrical signal throughout the nation. People all throughout the country leaned forward to listen as Leland Stanford, speaking on behalf of the Central Pacific, raised the sledgehammer. The telegraph clicked with every swing, completed. The bells of the church rung. Cannons exploded. Celebrations erupted in cities. It seemed as though a national artery had been sewn together in real time, from New York to San Francisco. No longer were the East and West separated by months. By rail, they were separated by 7 days. It was an amazing feat of engineering. Steel and steam now bound the United States from coast to coast. It was impossible to exaggerate the symbolic importance. A young post-Civil War country had demonstrated its ability to mend its rifts and advance into the contemporary industrial age. However, not everyone joined in the festivities. The picture did not include any of the Chinese laborers who had laid the majority of the Central Pacific's track. Despite their part in making the unthinkable possible, they had been completely left out of the event. Additionally missing from the frame were native guides, Irish laborers, freedmen, and other marginalized workers. They were replaced by bearded men with cigars and hammers in frock jackets. Thus, although the nation rejoiced in its unity, the truth was more nuanced. Although the railroad brought the East and West together, it also widened racial, socio-economic, and cultural gaps. Although many lives were lost, it brought markets together. The official railroad narrative was caught in that day's photograph. However, what is the true story? It was hidden under the track. In addition to reducing geographic area, the Transcontinental Railroad's completion caused the American economy to soar. Almost immediately, the United States was no longer a country with two coasts that were awkwardly connected by wilderness. Now, it was a single economic entity that was teeming with activity, trade, and opportunity. In less than a week, goods that formerly took months to carry by wagon or ship could suddenly be moved from coast to coast. Midwest agricultural goods, such as wheat, corn, and cattle, could be transported east to industrial centers or west to prosperous mining communities. The flow of manufactured items was in the other direction. Oxen were replaced with rail cars. Sail was supplanted by steam. Once a border of uncertainty, it is now a lucrative supply chain. Almost quickly, railroad villages sprung up along the train like weeds. Some rapidly vanished, especially if the rail line changed, while others developed into cities. However, each one was a node in an expanding network, linked by a constant cadence of smoke, whistles, and pistons. The railroad contributed to the expansion of industry as well. Demand soared for coal mines, ironworks, and lumber mills. Jobs were generated nationwide by the demand for infrastructure, railroads, and locomotives. Along the way, small business owners opened general stores, restaurants, and hotels, while steel barons and railroad tycoons became wealthy, and bankers loaded their coffers. Mail traveled more quickly. Instead of weeks, news traveled across time zones in days. The government was able to establish a genuine presence throughout the entire continent for the first time, sending troops, resources, and political clout wherever the trains could go, not to mention the human element. In the West, millions of people migrated. European immigrants who had previously arrived in New York now had a clear route to employment and land in the Western Territories, California, and Oregon. The same steel road led homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws to their respective destinations. Naturally, not everyone benefited equally from this boom. Money poured up. Native territories were ravaged. Workers continued to live in poverty. However, it cannot be denied. The US became a continental power once the railroad turned it from a regional republic. Not merely people were being moved by the engine. Money, power, and the future were all being moved. And once it got going, it wouldn't stop. A deeper, more sad legacy was hidden behind the Transcontinental Railroad's gleaming steel and victorious headlines. The loss of native traditions, territories, and lives. Not all of the railroad's connections were east-west. It carved out pathways through territory occupied by the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and many more, slicing into traditional homelands. Rails, telegraph lines, and fencing now separated what had previously been broad plains and holy land. Native sovereignty was undermined with every spike driven. The effect was severe and instantaneous. To make room for trains and settlers, buffalo herds, essential to plains tribes' economies, cuisines, and spirituality, were mass murdered. In many instances, travelers were urged to shoot buffalo from moving trains for fun. In just a few decades, these herds, which had once numbered in the tens of millions, declined to almost extinction. It was not just tracks that the railroad brought. It brought with it surveyors, soldiers, and settlers. Where there had been no towns, they appeared. The federal government gave homesteaders the authority to make claims on tribal lands. The railroad now absorbed what treaties had not taken. Enforcement and military garrisons were dispatched with the settlers to guard the tracks and put down any opposition. Wars broke out. In a series of brutal conflicts that some referred to as uprisings and others as outright massacres, the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes retaliated. The railroad served as both the battlefield and the target of conflicts ranging from Red Cloud's War to the Battle of Little Bighorn. Resistance was eventually defeated. Native American tribes were forced to live on reservations, frequently hundreds of miles away from their ancient homelands. There was a huge psychological cost. Sites of worship were desecrated. Hunting habits were disrupted. Nomadic societies, which relied on open space and seasonal travel, were compelled to settle in permanent areas while being watched closely. And advancement served as justification for everything. Though it cost the dreams of 1,000 nations, the Transcontinental Railroad was praised as a marvel of American ingenuity. Timetables and timbers took the place of a way of life, and it was more than simply iron that sliced through the landscape. The railroad is frequently praised in history books for bringing a nation together, yet for Native Americans, it caused their nation to fall apart. Not only did the railroad come to an end when the last spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, but a new American identity, one that was faster, hungrier, and more heavily influenced by steel and steam, was born. The country shrank as a result of the Transcontinental Railroad. It now took 7 days by rail to do what used to take 6 months by wagon or ship. It altered how people traveled, how commodities were traded, and how distance itself was perceived. The idea of a coast-to-coast country suddenly became a reality rather than a pipe dream. Time zones were established to facilitate cross-country travel and trade, and the railroad contributed to their growth. Farmers were able to ship their produce across state lines as a result of the restructuring of agriculture. By facilitating the efficient flow of raw materials into urban industries, it propelled the Second Industrial Revolution. The cacophony of trains started to blend into the country's cadence. In terms of culture, the railroad strengthened the idea that America was destined to extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a concept known as manifest destiny. It gave the impression that growth was not only feasible but also inevitable. There was no longer an untamed frontier thanks to trains that crossed plains, mountains, and deserts. Everything seemed accessible and defensible. However, the railroad also established the model for American corporate power. At the top, enormous wealth accrued. In addition to being wealthy, men like Thomas Durant, Collis Huntington, and Leland Stanford controlled policy, bought politicians, and established empires. The extent to which railroad interests were ingrained in government was made clear by corruption scandals, such as the Crédit Mobilier incident. The railroad rails represented both opportunity and exploitation for workers. It was the end of a world for indigenous peoples. It resulted in significant changes for the ecosystem. Rivers were bridged, forests were removed, and buffalo were all but wiped out. Despite all of its expenses, the railroad unquestionably contributed to the development of a contemporary America. It linked companies to markets, immigrants to opportunities, and governments to far-off places. It made an experimental republic into a nation with full national integration. In addition to carrying people, the iron rails also carried ambition, devastation, hope, and hubris. The railroad was a tragedy as well as a victory. The nation was forever changed once the twin trains made contact with cowcatchers in the Utah desert. It was iron and fire, not war or election, that changed the country.